Alright, time for our first demo. I will be showing you the concept of working with these service classes by adding a service that will be used specifically to access data. We'll move all the code related to this into this specific service class. Now in this demo we are going to create our first service class, a service that actually interacts with a data source, so part of the model. Now at this point we already have our repositories, and the repositories, like I mentioned earlier in the course, are typically the place where you will put the code that does the nitty details of interacting with the data source, which could be a local database or a REST service. Now, I don't want to put that type of code, that repository, directly in my view model. The reason, you may be asking, well, very good question. Very often in my application, a view model will need data from multiple repositories. In that case, I would need to litter my view models with the code to talk with multiple repositories and perhaps combine the response to feed the view. That is not typically code I want to put in my view models. Remember, the view models need to be as simple and clean as possible. So I will really put an extra layer in between. That will be my service in this case, which will contain the knowledge to interact with the data services through the repositories. And we will then use these services from the view models. So let's do that now. I'm going to group all my data services as well as my other services that we'll create in the next demo in a folder called services. So let's click here and add a new folder. And let's call that services. And in there, we are going to create our new data service. I prefer to use these service classes with an interface. So I will call my actual class the PyDataService. So we'll create first an iPyDataService interface. So let us change this to be an interface. Now, which operations am I going to expose on my interface, on my data service? Well, I propose to add the following: a method to get all the pies, a method to add a pie, and another one to update a pie. And that looks rather similar to, in this case, our repository, and that is definitely true. Let me bring in the using statement. Now, like I said, this looks very similar to what we had in the pie repository. Indeed, there too we had a list of pies, an add pie, and an update pie. Now, why am I then creating that service, you may be asking? Well, I don't want to use the repositories directly. This PyDataService could perhaps also need to talk with another repository. We'll now have a one-on-one mapping, but in real-life applications, a data service might also need to interact with other repositories. All right, let us now implement that service. So I'm going to create a class, and that will, of course, be the PyDataService. This class, of course, another public class, will implement the iPyDataService interface. Let me bring in the implementation for this service. Now, this PyDataService is in any case going to wrap the Py repository. As you can see here, I'm using the static methods on my Py repository to get all the pies, add a pie, and update a pie. And as said, it would be the data services functionality to combine perhaps the response from different repositories. Now, how am I going to use my PyDataService? Well, we're going to use it from the view model. For example, from the Py overview view model. Over here, I was still using the Py repository directly. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to use our PyDataService. I could, of course, over here directly use the PyDataService, but I'll rather use another approach. Let me go to the app.xaml.cs. In most of my applications, things like a data service are going to be used as a singleton. So what I typically do is I will create a single instance of, in this case, the PyDataService on the application level. In most of my applications, I will use dependency injection for that. And a dependency injection container is an easy way to create a single instance of an object and have that object be available throughout the entire application. Since that is not the focus in this course, I'm going to go around the use of a dependency injection container, but I'm going to instead use a single instance of my PyDataService directly here on my app class. Here I'm now instantiating a single instance of the PyDataService. I'm also doing that in a static way. Now, because I've created that here as a static property on the app class, I can now use this from anywhere I want in my application. That would be The same if I use a dependency injection container. So I'll now remove this line of code here, and I'll now get the pies from the PyDataService defined on the application level. At this point, my view models are no longer dependent on the repositories. I've now created a data service that contains business logic, and that is used directly from the view model. The view model has no knowledge on how it needs to interact with the different data sources. That is all encapsulated within the data service. I've again cleaned up my view models a bit. I've removed another dependency.